Dr. Irvin Studin is the founder, editor-in-chief, and publisher of Global Brief magazine, as well as the president of the Institute for 21st Century Questions, a leading Canadian think tank. He began his career as an advisor and analyst on a wide variety of domestic and international issues in the Prime Minister's Department of Canada's Privy Council office in Ottawa, and on secondment in Australia's Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet in Canberra. Studin was a professor and program director at the School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Toronto from 2009 until 2014, and a visiting professor at leading schools of public policy in North America, Europe, and Asia. He is also the chair of the Worldwide Commission to Educate All Kids post-pandemic, an international initiative to address the catastrophe faced by millions of children ousted from all forms of schooling during the COVID-19 pandemic. He joins us today in our latest episode of Advocata Conversations.
Dr. Irvin Studin, welcome to Advocata Conversation. Welcome to Sri Lanka.
Thank you for having me.
Perhaps for the benefit of our audience, can you tell us your story?
I don't know whether it's a long or short story or particularly
long story
interesting.
Will do.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here in Sri Lanka. I've been all over the world, all over South Asia, but first time in Sri Lanka and in Colombo in particular. I'm coming from Canada. I live in the suburbs of Toronto. Was born in Rome on the way to Canada from the former Soviet Union at the age of 2 months. My parents are from the famous port city of Odessa. I'm a brother of three children to wonderful parents, and now a father of three with a wife who's wonderful, who herself is from the former Soviet Union. My wife Ala is from Moldova, one of the former republics, and educated at York University in Toronto in the Schulich School of Business, then at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, and at London School of Economics, and finally a PhD in constitutional law at a famous law school in Canada called Osgoode Hall Law School, also at York University. And in between, I managed to work in the Privy Council office. That was the start of my career, and that's for three different prime ministers on the nonpartisan side in the apparatus of the civil service in Ottawa, the Canadian capital. And I started my career working on international affairs, national security, a host of matters, advising different prime ministers as they came in, what was called transition planning, everything from immigration to agriculture, to governance and federalism, and the Arctic eventually. When I left the civil service, I joined academia. I became a professor at the University of Toronto, which is one of the famous universities, both of the world and particularly in North America, at the School of Public Policy and Governance. That was very nascent at the time. So I was professor there for about half a decade, and also program director in the graduate school, teaching a wide variety of subjects. I was also a visiting professor in Singapore at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, which was quite young at the National University of Singapore, taught in Ukraine and Russia and different parts of North America. At the same time, towards the end of my time in academia, but certainly upon leaving, I created a think tank called the Institute for 21st Century Questions, along with a colleague of mine who is based in The Hague, a Canadian no less. And we worked together to define this concept of a leading think tank for Canada, but solving a host of both global and national problems. And today we have a list of about 15 problems. So at the time it was maybe a dozen. We created a magazine also called Global Brief magazine, which is the major international affairs magazine coming out of Canada. I've written a number of books. I do a lot of advisory work with different governments. I do a lot of public speaking and teaching. And I'm also a former football player, soccer player of some caliber. Maybe not strong by Sri Lankan standards, but it was strong by North American standards. And I was
What position did you play?
I played center midfield.
Okay.
It was my position. So I wouldn't say I was the Canadian Messi, but
Right.
but
You were good?
What's that?
You were good?
I would say, my old self would say I was good.
I know when you have a Rhodes Scholarship, you have to be a fairly well-rounded person.
Yeah.
So besides academic excellence, what else did you have?
Well, they certainly made a mistake with me, but I was captain of the varsity soccer team, as we
Right.
call it, in North America for one of the leading universities in football in Canada. And
Did you play professionally?
yeah, I played professionally as well and could have gone to that path, but it was a lonely path in Canada because we didn't have the infrastructure that we have today. Today we have Major League Soccer, and a lot of very strong Canadian athletes play professionally around the world, and quite some of them are remarkable. And although they might be slightly better than me, they certainly profit from a real infrastructure. And at the time, it was a very lonely infrastructure. So the path better traveled was to go to academia, whereas some of my teammates went to Werder Bremen. One of them famously won the double championship with Werder Bremen in the Bundesliga. I went to Oxford. So it was a different path. Although we're good colleagues now, and when we speak about education, I'll say that our paths reunited on that topic a couple decades later. So I played soccer and around the world, represented Canada a little bit, and then, but my mind was always wandering towards not just intellectual problems, but the question of how the world works, how decision makers think, how to solve really practical problems, and of course the different cultures of the world. And that's also why it's a real pleasure to be here in Sri Lanka.
So before we move on to some of your work and what you have written about, what has brought you to Sri Lanka?
Well, I'm here in Sri Lanka because we're post-pandemic now, I think. And the pandemic period was difficult for most of the world and on a host of fronts. But we discovered that in my submission, the biggest catastrophe for mankind of the pandemic period was in the education space, and for children in particular. And that is a moral problem because of the obligation we owe to children to prepare them for tomorrow. But it's also a strategic problem for many countries around the world. That is, if you've underprepared your children for the challenges of tomorrow, what tomorrow is there? And Sri Lanka, much like my own country, Canada, has probably underestimated the extent of the catastrophe. And I'm here to report on the work we did through the Institute for 21st Century Questions in creating a commission across 60 countries to explain and understand this problem, what we call the education crisis generally, and the third bucket crisis in particular, its consequences, what's to be done to fix it to the extent that one can, and what's to be done to ensure that it never happens again.
So you called it the third bucket.
Yeah.
The first bucket was people who got to go to school, the second who did it virtually, and the third who didn't go to school.
Yeah.
So do you have some kind of estimate how big the third bucket is?
Well, let me refine the understanding a little bit. And it's easier for you to say in Sri Lanka, than, believe it or not, that it is for me to say in North America, because when you say no school at all, that rings strangely to Canadian ears. What do you mean no school? It took me a long time to explain that no school really literally means no school. There's no conspiracy about it. It's not a critique of curricula. It's not a preference for a certain type of homeschooling or pod schooling.
Your laws mandate schooling, right?
All countries, advanced and even less advanced, mandate a certain type of schooling, but that collapsed during the pandemic. So what happened is, in March of 2020, everyone will appreciate that the schools closed in most countries of the world almost concurrently. So when they closed, we imagined in many countries, starting in Canada, that the children pivoted to online virtual schooling. The second bucket. First bucket is physical classical school. Second bucket is virtuals or online school. And the third bucket is no school at all. But what happened, and you'll appreciate in Sri Lanka, but was also true in Canada, is that as soon as you went online, a certain contingent of students had no access to school at all, or to a device, and that number grew as the closure endured. And in Canada, the numbers were in the low 100,000s, and in Sri Lanka, the numbers were much larger. But even if you were in the second bucket, that is, if you were in virtual schooling, not only was the quality of schooling highly compromised, but you might have been in an abusive home, so you're at home, but you're being beaten or sexually abused or virtually, so that's no education. or you're hungry. You went to school to eat, but now you're at home stuck and you're not malnourished. Your family may not be able to have the means to support your education or life in general. You could have fallen ill if you had a handicap and you were at home in virtual learning. Say you were autistic or otherwise intellectually disabled, you're in trouble. In countries like Canada, if you're in an immigrant family and you didn't have mastery of the language of instruction, English or French, you're online schooling, you're out into the third bucket. And the most catastrophic category that people didn't realize, again, starting in my own country, was that once we closed the schools, for teenagers in particular, school lost all meaning. And so there was no boyfriend, no girlfriend, no sports, no music, no teachers, no friendship, no mentorship, no spirit, and of course, no walls. So the cost of exit from education was a matter of just turning off the Zoom call or turning off the phone or turning off the computer, and they were out into the ether. And they were out just when their adolescent narcissism required for someone to search for them, but no one knew they were out, and they were out for a long time. Then the schools reopen and the child is 2 years older, but should have to catch up, and there's neither a mechanism to get the child back nor a mechanism for catching up in the school. The child is out. So you all of a sudden have this massive contingent of hundreds of millions of third bucket kids around the world, hundreds of millions, with no education at all or huge undereducation, being thrust into a world that in a secular sense requires all the more preparation, because it's a more difficult world than it was in 2019 in all senses. And so the gap is a misery gap for many countries in particular. And so we're here to talk about that.
So how long did this go on for, the third bucket? Has normalcy been restored?
No, but I think this is the misapprehension. There is no normalcy in restoration, because for two reasons. One, when you close the schools, the third bucket happens immediately, right? And if you stay there for a long time, right, that child is a different child. This is 2 years later. In Uganda, for instance, they closed the schools for 2 years consecutively. The children just disappeared into the labor force or into early marriage. The teachers themselves disappeared. The physical school might have disappeared. So there was no normalcy to which to return. The same thing in India and Pakistan, and dare I say in parts of Sri Lanka, but also in countries that fancy themselves maybe near the top of the development index, Canada, the United Kingdom, same phenomenon. It started there, just as it might have started here. It was the same human disintegration. But the other problem is that when the schools reopened, decision makers said, well, we're back to normal. The schools are open. Education is on. But they forgot that science is not just epidemiology. It's also physics. And in physics, you have thermodynamics. And the second law of thermodynamics is the law of entropy. As soon as you close a system, it disintegrates unless you provide a compensating energy. And we didn't provide the compensating energy, so we reopened the schools in a state of increased or increasing disintegration. So it's a lower level of energy. And that's where we are. There were only a few exceptional countries or communities that understood this, either implicitly or explicitly, and that said we have to come back with high energy. Jamaica, small parts of the United States, very small pockets of the UK and Canada, parts of Argentina, some parts of India, and that's about it for the third bucket. But some countries then look at the third bucket countries like Sri Lanka and Canada and the UK and the US, and they say, you guys are Martian, we have no third bucket. And why don't you have third bucket? Because they barely close the schools, or they close the schools for extremely short periods, or they understood that there would be this leakage into the third bucket and so provided this compensatory energy. So we're talking about China, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, some countries in Central and Eastern Europe, some countries in Africa even, right? Which will be ahead coming out of this.
So now this is something that has already happened.
Yeah.
So what can be done about it?
Well, three things, and that's one of the...
First of all, is there a recognition of the problem?
there's a recognition of the problem, starting with our work. This
Right.
is now across 60 countries, and I'm here meeting with, I will be meeting with the Prime Minister, I'll be meeting with the former President of Sri Lanka, education and policy leaders. One of the great founding members of the Commission is Tara Demel, former education minister in Sri Lanka. So there's a recognition, but it's not a felt appreciation that this happened. And it's also very difficult to appreciate that this happened under people's watch. What do you mean? We disintegrated the next generation, so we underprepared. Dare I say, even India, your neighbor, with a great respect, doesn't understand what's happened at its feet. So India may talk haute politique, high politics, but doesn't understand the next generation will not be able to compete, let's say, with countries like China or Japan or South Korea that didn't disintegrate the education.
So in the third bucket, say, example of India, what proportion do you think fall into the third bucket?
Up to 100 million young Indians.
100 million.
Up
Of
to
a
100 million.
cohort of totally how much? 300-400 million?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay,
Like
so
this
about
is a learning
25%.
of the recent global summit that we had in Toronto of the Commission.
Okay.
And Indian representatives reported maybe between 60 and 100 million, with the numbers being very difficult to
Okay.
estimate, but always formally underestimated.
Okay, so between 15 and 25% of the school
I
going
say humbly. I say humbly.
So that similar ratio may apply in many of these countries, right?
It would be higher in some countries, like in Uganda. It might be the total student body, because nobody went to school, or except in the very elite segments, the international schools, because they closed for 2 years. So how would you?
So in Uganda, they closed the schools for 2
the
years?
longest in the world, the longest without interruption. It wasn't serial closures like you had in Sri Lanka. You had long closures and then a small opening, and then after 21 months, I understand you reopened, although albeit with low energy. In Uganda, it was 2 years straight, and in Canada, it was variable. But in my own province of Ontario, which is the largest in Canada and has some of the largest school boards in North America, the school closures were longest on the continent. And
Which
in
was
some
for how
cases,
long?
I couldn't tell you in exact weeks. They could have been, I would say maybe 8 or 9 months with interruptions. But these are closures with imagined virtual learnings. But the problem is that the formulation of the school closure in a place like Ontario was also what I would call degenerate, which is to say the leader said, we are closing the schools indefinitely. Well, if a leader says indefinitely, he's speaking or she's speaking to an adult audience, because for the youth audience, indefinitely means that's it, that's the permanent condition. No schooling is your life, so you better go and find something else to do. And so they did. So the teenagers, for instance, upon hearing that, would go out into either into antisocial behavior, the gangs, or be depressed on the internet, or sit in their basement, or to criminal behavior or self-harm, because they had no structure, they had lost everything, there was no interest in the society. And then you open up your back to the putatively normal, but the child is vastly underprepared. And you, the adult, ask what's wrong, and the child himself or herself doesn't quite realize what the problem is. So you have an explosion of youth violence, you have an explosion of homelessness, antisocial behavior, very poor habits, no punctuality, no discipline, no grit, confidence, poor dress. All of these things are basic social habits that are developed, not through school qua school, but in school as a rite of passage in all advanced societies.
And what can be done about this?
So the first thing, of course, is recognize the problem, right, as the central, in my view, catastrophe of the pandemic, because it bleeds into everything. You want a workforce tomorrow? Well, is it educated or not, right? And the second is maximally find these kids. Now we're very late in the game. Find these kids and return them maximally to school, or some measure of schooling with a bespoke choreography. That's huge work. But I'll mention a bit later that we're doing that already through a project we started at the Institute called Project Youth Energy. And finally, and this is a key council for Sri Lanka, and I hope Sri Lanka will actually be a leader in this, and there are some quarters already that are understanding this, for this never to happen again for the balance of the century. That is, for all societies to appreciate that the major learning of the pandemic period, just as there are major learnings in wars, is to never close the schools, ever. It's a baseline no-go zone. And for the reasons I articulate, because if you close them, you immediately have entropic disintegration, and you're underprepared for tomorrow.
How do you address the healthcare concerns? Because this was an epidemic and it was contagious. So the contagion happened through close proximity. So how can you never close school?
Of course, it's not quite figurative, but it is an imperative to say, almost like you wouldn't close the hospitals or you wouldn't close your military, and certain institutions are no-go zones for closures. Then you realize the centrality of the school system, you find fewer reasons to close. Because I could also say, well, there's an epidemic today, but well, the epidemic or the pandemic is grave or not so grave. In this case, it was not that grave, by historical terms, and on all the evidence, epidemiological evidence, it posed zero harm to children as such. So that should have been the first understanding, and all intelligent societies understood this very early on. Within the first 2 or 3 months, they observed the children are fine, and so we need to find a way to keep them going. Not to say that in order to save the rest of the population, the next generation must be collapsed. It's a way of self-harm that, by the way, saw Canada make the same mistake that countries like Sri Lanka and India and Pakistan made. But there will be cases where there are enemies at the gates. There could be an army at the gates, and of course you would close the school. But there are lessons there. First of all, if you close the school, it must be in the most extraordinary circumstances, as a last resort. Certainly not a first resort, not a casual one, and not a capricious one. We were closing schools like it was going out of style, without even thinking. We were closing them by decree of health officials who didn't understand education systems, who did not see them, who did not have any skin in the game, who had no accountability for the consequences. So that should never happen. It should be top of mind. You close the schools only in extraordinary circumstances. And then you close them for extremely short periods. And then there must be a very public pronouncement as to the date of return, so that children know, okay, they're closed for 2 days, but you're back tomorrow. And you say, well, that's a lot of work. But it is a lot of work because of the importance. And you say, well, are there countries that are doing that? Of course, many war-torn countries, and I don't want to speak to the Sri Lankan case over the last few decades, but many war-torn countries never closed the schools, even during war. In Ukraine today, where there's heavy bombardment, the children went to the metro system underground and started learning. And now they've created a network of classrooms across the metro system, right? And that shows where there's a will, there's a way. And human innovation suggests that we can find that way. But the way also is, my humble counsel, is not just virtual schooling. Let's give everyone a device and imagine that they're getting education just because you're connecting with them. That is, first of all, a pathway to the third bucket, but it is also proven to be compromised learning. That is, they'll be undereducated when they come out of it, if that type of schooling is sustained.
So what can, now for the kids who fell into the third bucket, is there a remedial action that can be taken? Or is it just time is lost and there's nothing that we can do about it?
I refuse to concede that there's nothing we can do. Of course, there's a lot that we can do, but the numbers are huge and time has passed, and the mistake is not yet fully understood. And now we see how much work and resources would be required to remedy it. But I can give some examples of success that I hope will inspire countries like Sri Lanka and others. In Canada, we've started on a small scale through our work, a project called Project Youth Energy, PYE. And energy is very apposite as a term, because you need energy for the young people to get them out of this low entropic equilibrium back to where they ought to be in 2023, 2024. Not just given their exit from the school system over time, but because of the requirements of tomorrow that are more difficult. So we're actually searching for these third bucket kids across Canada, bringing them back to education and or first employment and getting them skilled up, either both academically and in professional terms, and also socially, and mentorship is important. You'll find that the work is very interesting, but it's very bespoke. I mean, every child has their own reasons for exit. It could have been abuse, it could have been the virtual schooling, it could have been, there are small cases of truancy, and there are cases of handicaps and all sorts of the human panoply. In Jamaica, however, is an interesting story that was reported at our recent global summit of the Commission, and that is that they went what they call yard to yard. And they say it in a very Jamaican, it was a yard to yard. And they actually found the kids, brought them back to school, and with huge energy and support by the community and the government and the schools and mentors, got a lot of them back and added 2 years of schooling, which, by the way, is an important, I think, innovation in school systems, at least for a temporary period, to add a year or two to the schooling regime to recognize this emergency, because the children need more incubation. But they were able to, through this infusion of energy and hard work, to have results that excel those of 2019, if you can imagine, in academic terms, because they engineered this. So that's a good example. The other example, however, is to pretend it didn't exist, it didn't happen, or this is just a lost generation. We lost the generation 2 or 3 years. It's a strange, in my view, strategic stupidity to just say it didn't exist, because it will bite us in 5 to 10 years' time, all societies. Or to say it happened, but say, well, I'm going to focus on things that are more pleasant. I'm going to focus on geopolitics or the economy. But history will show that when these kids come and the country is behind, because it can only fall behind, I'm talking about all these countries, that these are mistakes, failures of adult responsibility. Yeah.
Okay. Moving on to some of your writings, I think you wrote a book called Canada Should Think for Itself.
Yeah.
What is the main thrust of that book?
The book is called, it's a little prolix, but it's Canada Must Think for Itself, 10 Theses for Our Country's Survival and Success in the 21st Century. And I understand part of the second reason I'm here is I understand it's a bestseller in Sri Lanka. So very excited about that. It's a distillation of my thinking over the last 10 or 15 years on a host of policy issues. But of course, the zeal for the project comes from a few meditations. One is that every country has a shelf life, or every structure within a country, a constitutional strategic structure, has a shelf life. And I calculate that it was about 60 years over the last several hundred years for most countries, average of 60 years. Now, Canada is, in the modern scheme of things, a very old country politically. We're well over a century and a half of stable government, and there are very few countries around the world that have this little degree of disruption. So 150 minus 60, that means we're pushing our luck. And so we will have to be lucky, but also work very hard. And the work has to be informed by thinking. But now the thinking is in a troubled state, because after the pandemic, we have 7 or 8 major crises in the country, systems crises in Canada, that are difficult to appreciate for someone who has an image of Canada as one of the most stable countries. So we really are in trouble across the systems. And so who's going to do the thinking for us? Well, we look around the world and we say, well, we have some friends. We have a lot of enemies now, growing list of enemies. And I don't think our friends are particularly impressive. And so they either cannot do the thinking for us because they're not that stable themselves, or they don't understand our particular interests, or even maybe parasitic on us. They may be predatory. And so it's for us. Well, how do we do the thinking? Oh my goodness. Well, that's a mindset problem. And then we have to then understand our circumstances properly, which we often don't in Canada. We don't even understand our own geography. And then how do we solve it? And then the solutions are, I think, very interesting, innovative, and imaginative, but require a huge amount of work. And the work is consonant with this energy concept that we talked about in education, which, by the way, is one of the systems crises. Because if you start from here post-pandemic, but you have to be here, the only way to get there is energy, 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 work, work, work. So we cannot tweet our way out of our misery. It cannot just change governments. We cannot just muddle through as we have historically, or count on on the beneficence of the gods that typically have favored Canada. It's time to think for ourselves.
Okay. And some of your core ideas, can you elaborate a little bit about few of these 10?
Yeah. Well, the ones the most popular in Sri Lanka are, for instance, if you look at Canada, you'll appreciate that it is the second largest country in the world. I mean, it is really huge and internally extremely complex. And
why do you say that Canada is internally very complex?
it's very complex. It's very, I mean, even Canadians don't understand our own complexity, but the simplest way to say it is that if you have the second largest country in the world, you're by definition going to be quite complex. In my view, the most complex country in the world, and I've written a book about it, is Russia. And it can only be thus because it has 14 land borders and 3 or 4 other maritime borders, plus huge diversity internally. Therefore, you have the most complex country in the world by far, and very difficult to govern. And Canada is only slightly behind. Now, it's even more complex than we imagined because in the modern sense, we have 4 borders. We always talk about the American reality, and I know you're interested in talking about that. And most Canadians only talk about the American reality. But if this is America, then this is China, this is Europe, and this is Russia, and they all border us, literally border us.
You call it ARC, right?
ACRE, acre, not
acre.
arc, ACRE, and that becomes a 4-point game. And why do I say that? Well, America is obviously the longest undefended border in the world. Canada and the United States is our original enemy, now our ally. It was our original enemy. China is closer geographically to northern Canada and British Columbia than it is to Australia. The Australians say they're in Asia. Well, that means Canada is much more in Asia than Australia. And I worked in the Australian system for a little while. I can tell you we're much more complex in Canada. But Canada doesn't know that it's in Asia because most of Canada psychologically lives in the eastern part of the country. We're also close to Europe, historically. It's where the modern settlers came from. And now the 4th reality is Russia, across the Arctic, which is melting. And there are 2 Arctic giants this century, Russia and Canada. I mean, really giants. And they juxtapose. So Russia is not, as we imagine in Canada, to the east of Ukraine or to the east of Europe, but is immediately ahead, above us. Well, that changes the reality. Now, if you do the math, you do the combinations of that 4-point game, you have 15 combinations of push and pull on Canada's borders that could crush us or disintegrate us at any time, right? In any form. It could be a Russia-China axis, it could be a China-America axis, which we recently felt. It could be a Russia-Europe axis, any combination. And Canada is not ready for it. So to manage that, we have to make some really major thought migrations, new investments, and up our strategic game. And so that's the starting point to say, well, now we're in the big leagues. We're surrounded by the big boys. And by the way, we're one of the big boys if we want to make it. And in my submission, we will survive it. We will be one of the major countries of the world by dint of surviving this. Now, it's less threatening than it appears because one of the exits, this is another thesis, but I don't know if it's the 2nd or the 6th or the 7th. The book came out a little while ago. So one of the sources of exit is through the north. Now, for Sri Lanka, this will be a bit of an abstraction, but the north is not as you might imagine it, polar bears and frozen tundra and maybe ice rinks. Is there an ice rink anywhere in Sri Lanka?
No, unfortunately not.
No? But I think your ice hockey team is stronger than your football team, I think, if I call the stats. You must imagine the Arctic border is just another border, much like the American border is a border. And it is cold, yes, but it is melting because of climate change. And so as it melts, we have an imperative both to tame it, to manage it, and eventually to populate it. And in populating it, but also moving the mental map of Canada northward towards what I call the R-axis, the Arctic axis, we change the world and we up our circumstances. Why? Because if we can imagine that some of the major Canadian northern cities like Whitehorse or Inuvik or Yellowknife, this is geography for Sri Lanka, all of a sudden, let's say they become the Singapore of the Arctic. And then all of a sudden it's much more attractive than Singapore because Canada becomes the nexus for Russia in the former Soviet space, China and Northeast Asia, if not Southeast Asia, the United States, continental North America, and continental Europe, all told a market of 7-to-1 larger than the United States alone, right? And Canada creates the architecture through our north, right? Otherwise, we prepare for war, which will crush us, or we enmesh them in our own web, our own algorithm. But that takes an intellectual construction, then a policy construction, then a diplomatic construction, and then execution. And that's a lot of work, but it's some of the work that will help us get out of our terrible doldrums now, our systems crises. So it's an optimistic, ambitious program for the country that will, I hope, help carve a 21st century that is interesting and still real for us.
One of the things that I picked up in one of the video interviews you gave about your book is how culturally or literally you are so dominated by what happens, for example, in the US or the Anglo-Saxon traditions like UK. So when you look at the Canadian identity, does Canada feel that it has a unique identity or place in the world, or is it just part of the larger Anglo-Saxon sphere?
Yeah, this is an age-old question without a certain answer. And I think until the pandemic, it was a matter of quiet examination by intellectuals and policy people, and maybe the lay citizen as well. Post-pandemic, it's almost irrelevant in the sense that, first of all, when we talk about place in the world, Canada's place in the world is a nomenclature that is absurd because, as we see in the world, no one owes us a place in the world. It's not as if we're there to find a poetic telos in the sphere of nations. We can, as I said, disappear tomorrow, and then we'll just be in the flotsam of history. Maybe once there was a small kingdom called Canada, and then it wasn't. And even in the grand scheme of Indigenous history in Canada, this experiment of confederation will have been a passing experiment. Even though in Canada, as I say, before the pandemic, you would say nothing could bother the country. It's an eternity. But I always worried about. So the question of identity is less important than the question of strategy, because the original strategy of Canada at confederation, this may be difficult to accept from the outside or in Sri Lanka, was that we were the counter thesis to the American Revolution. The Americans revolted, and Canada's leaders or elites stayed loyal to the crown. That was it. We fancied they were crazy. They were crazy. Why are you revolting? We stay loyal. We put our bets with the crown. We still think they're crazy. But the original enemy for which we created the counter thesis is now our ally. The problem is that over time, we have not only been dominated, but completely integrated into American political institutions, economic systems, and now, dare I say, not just the cultural space, but the information space, which I also discuss in the book, that it is very difficult to even carve out a Canadian concept. We don't understand our own geography. We cannot tell our own stories. We cannot think straight in the Canadian interest. It's all noise. It's all slogans and flags. It's a brouhaha that conspires to entropy rather than strategy and creation. So my team is Canada, not for this project here on education where I'm interested in the globe, but politically And strategically, I'm fighting for my team. So I say, well, how does the team survive? Well, this is a structure to survive. I'll give you the cardinal example, which I think will resonate in Sri Lanka as well. During the pandemic, almost everything went not just online, but into the social media space. I presume this was true to some extent in Sri Lanka, although I understand that newspapers are still important, and personal contact is still important, and television is still important in Sinhala and Tamil alike. But in Canada, everything went online. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Google, YouTube, right? A little bit of TikTok as well. But let's talk about the other ones first. What are they? What are these social media? They're all American algorithms. All of them. All of them are created in California and run by American companies through an American imagination and American control. And because we quickly subsumed all of our information space, including our major newspapers and media and television channels and radio, to these algorithms, everything in the national space in Canada was conditioned by what these algorithms said. So much so that during the pandemic in particular, but even today, we could not tell ourselves our own reality. One, because we had to speak on terms that were acceptable to the American algorithm. Two, because the American algorithm could cut anyone off at any point, including the Prime Minister, from speaking. And three, because the American algorithm could sweep the entire national discussion to something that was completely foreign to our reality. We had the biggest gun massacre in Canadian history at the nadir of the first lockdowns in April of 2021 in Nova Scotia. It's a beautiful province. We had the biggest gun massacre. And most Canadians don't know about it. And certainly my own neighbors don't know about it. Why? Because they were on social media following the American racial or ethnic protests at the time. And that was what exercised them. And that was what was important. But we could not tell ourselves our own reality. The businesses were disintegrating across Canada. But we couldn't report this to the decision makers. The decision makers were captured by what Kim Kardashian was saying a certain day. I don't know whether Kim Kardashian is a big celebrity in Sri Lanka. If she is, it's because of the same forces that would make her a celebrity in Canada, but with that much more intensity. And I would call to colleagues in Northwest Territories in the Arctic of Canada and say, what's going on in the schools there? What about the businesses? And they said, oh, I just heard Trump sent this tweet, that tweet. What does that have to do with your reality? So we could not tell our own reality. And so we have the current nonsense that the entire information space is controlled from California. A country that doesn't control its information space cannot talk to itself in its own language, in its own terms. And we now have the nonsense of the federal government fighting with the social media companies for some description of control of the social media space, and the social media companies being able to blackmail the government and saying that we will not allow Canadian stories to be shared on the social media unless you abide by our terms. So you not only have the federal government vassalized by Washington. I should say I'm not anti-American, I'm an admirer, but I'm speaking, but vassalized by specific companies in the United States, and many of them no less. So it's an intolerable situation for a country that needs to not be so small, but to be as big as I described by our given our strategic circumstances.
So, Irvin, economically, you're highly integrated, even through NAFTA, that it is one common market. Politically, your system has followed the Westminster system. It's a very different. It's a federal country, but you have been open to immigration. I mean, I believe that your Prime Minister has said that you need to take 500,000 people a year, something like that. So it has been very welcoming. All over the world, there is an anti-immigration politics going on. But Canada is 180 degrees U-turn to that they are very welcoming. They have
maybe 120 degrees, not 180.
Okay. But they have a very pro-immigration policy. What is the economic thesis behind that?
Well, of course, Canada has generally, in the modern sense, been a country of immigrants. But the original stock of British, Irish, and French immigrants go without saying. Those are the earliest waves. But I would say from the 60s, 70s, and 80s onwards, intensely global from all parts of the world. And these are deliberate policy pushes to populate a land that is, again, the second largest landmass in the world.
Is most of the landmass habitable?
Well, this is what I wish to get to. And originally it was along the American border. And I should say the original interest was not only economic, but it was strategic, because I mentioned that Canada is created as the counter thesis to the United States. So we needed to populate the border through forts and then military assets, and then eventually economic assets in order to maintain the sovereignty of the country. So most of the population is along the American border. Today, and even in my own book, one of the theses that I proffer is the idea that Canada at the end of the century should have a population of 100 million. And by the way, that looks impressive to Sri Lanka, but for Canada, it should not be impressive. Again, second largest landmass in the world. You ask whether it's habitable, and I mentioned that the north of the country is melting. If you go and look at even a Sri Lankan going to the Arctic in certain parts of the year should not be a terrifying experience for your proclivities. It's highly doable now because of climate change, and given climate change, given our borders, we're going to need to shift the population distribution northward. And that means while the majority will still live across the American border, there will need to be more people living towards the north, many more. And they cannot come only from internal reproduction. We have a low reproduction rate, but only through immigration. And therefore, that is certainly one of the motivating factors for the government, although I think the government understands it too naively and has not done enough work to distribute the population. So most of the population ends up in 3 or 4 major cities, starting with Toronto, then moving to Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Ottawa, right? But this is lazy. It's lazy immigration. So they come and then they're left to their own devices, whereas we should distribute and choreograph, including the mix, the population mix, so that we have a friendly domestic situation, everyone is well assimilated, but we have the mass in order to sustain a country that has many more pressures across its geography.
So the economic argument is compelling that you have a large landmass, but your historic settlers were Europeans.
Yeah.
Your new immigrants
Yeah.
are coming from different parts of the world. You've been welcoming people from all over, but I'm presuming that majority of them are Asians, South Asians and East Asians.
Yeah.
So is this not creating any social issues?
Well, each wave of immigration in Canada has created social issues, including different European waves. So outside of the Anglo-Saxon, first the original tension was between English and French, and between European and Indigenous. And by the way, those issues are not completely settled, although the English-French one for now is tame. The European Indigenous one is now vexed and is a very big complicating factor, I would argue, even more than immigration today, for the future of Canada. That is, we have a reconciliation agenda across 500 Indigenous nations that is still to be negotiated and determined. But each new wave of immigrants, whether they were from Italy or from the former Soviet Union or Greece, and then from the Caribbean, and then from the Middle East, and now from Asia, of course, the earliest Chinese immigrants created tensions that today have historical sensitivities. But today we have not just Asia. Asia would account for maybe the half of the immigration mass yearly, but we have a lot of African, Middle East, some European, a lot of Latin American. And we do have an integration issue. Our integration challenges are no different from those of the United States. They use the melting pot symbolism. We use mosaic, but they're exactly the same. And I don't think that they necessarily do better or worse than us.
Do you have a statistic of what proportion of your population are foreign born?
Yeah, the proportion is in the major cities like Toronto, sometimes approaching 50%.
Wow.
But that's in the major cities. But in the whole of the country, up to 20%. It's maybe sometimes 25%. You still have the strong majorities are still Anglo-Saxon and Francophone, and those are the major plates that need to be managed. So in the book, I talk about immigration, but I talk about very choreographed immigration. It's not just mass. You need to be mindful of the majority-minority dynamics. That is, we can't imagine that the immigrant population will somehow surpass in weight the incumbent population. That would be unacceptable and shouldn't happen. You need to be mindful of Quebec's demographic weight in the population, which should always be at least 20%. So there's a preference to Francophone immigration. There's also a need for immigrants and the entire population to learn French in order to keep Quebec. Quebec is a major, not just complicating factor, a major nuance in Canadian federalism that is not found in other federations like Australia.
And how have these immigrants benefited Canada?
I think in the net, they've benefited Canada hugely. Canada's a far richer country than it would have been otherwise. It's far more interesting and eclectic, and the types of life experiences, services, and businesses and cultural offerings that exist within the country are not comparable to what they might have been in the absence of immigrants. It would have been a very stale, provincial, and probably unsustainable federation had we stuck with just the original settler population, and they concede as much. However, we probably have gone in the other direction now. Post-pandemic, it is, I wouldn't say a free-for-all, but it is highly massive, lazy immigration because of the systems that have collapsed. There's very little choreography and very little attention paid to integration, proper services, proper schooling, proper employment, the proper parcours of every immigrant family within the society, things that were well in place when my own family arrived.
You spent some time in the UK.
Yeah.
40 years ago, English food was really bad. The food scene has completely changed in the UK,
You think it's
even
good,
in the high street.
Yeah.
What about in Canada? All these immigrants, how is the food scene in Canada?
Well, until the pandemic, I thought that Toronto had the best food scene in the world.
Okay. Wow.
Until the pandemic. And now we have a highly collapsed food scene. It's one of the great tragedies that I think we have still not realized. Toronto in particular had every restaurant in the world. And in a very good way, we had 5 Chinatowns, 2 Little Indias, 2 Little Italys, little Jamaica, little Somalia, little Israel. We had everything. And there was perfect competition amongst the restaurants. So any bad quality would mean that the restaurant would go out of existence.
Did this percolate into the mainstream?
Absolutely. These were not sequestered or ghettoized to Chinatown. They were all Canadian.
So when you go to a supermarket in Canada, do you have a lot of international food that is now in the mainstream?
Yeah, it's highly mainstream, but the quality and selection has really suffered after the pandemic because the restaurants were the first to go. And this was the second major strategic mistake, that is that the businesses collapsed in many cases in the country, and these are businesses that took maybe 4 decades to build. It took 4 decades of immigration to build this restaurant scene that was second to none and far superior to that of the United Kingdom, where I lived, with the greatest respect to my British friends. They still don't know how to do coffee, but that has greatly suffered. So that was a loss. But in that sense, it was a huge plus. I should also say that in the good sense, immigrants in some of the major Canadian metropolises were fluidly integrated, so that when I grew up playing soccer in the fields of Toronto, and I played very intensely. All of my friends were from countries literally from all over the world, and therefore I could curse in 20 different languages, and I had friendships across the spectrum with no tensions at all. And the imagined diasporic tensions that you would have, let's say, between Tamil and Sinhalese, or Jew and Arab, or
Serbian and Croats.
Serbian and Croat, maybe. No, Serbian, Croat, or Russian, they didn't exist, right? They didn't exist. We were all friends, and that exists now. But again, because of the norms that were collapsed during the pandemic in a much more precarious way, whereas before I think it was organically beautiful.
So, Irvin, in the final part of our discussion, you are a keen commentator on geopolitics, and there's a lot going on in the world. There is the heightened crisis that is happening in Israel. There is disagreement between Canada and India. There is the big American-China issue. Would you like to comment on some of these geopolitical tensions?
The world has three major conflicts coming out of the pandemic, right? Leave aside the Israel Hamas one. We don't know where that will go. It's in a very acute state, but it's still not global. But like I would say, the North Korean conflict, India, Pakistan, these are regional conflicts that may or may not. But there are three global conflicts that I think are of moment, and I can comment on those, and then maybe I'll end with an optimistic note for Sri Lanka. And one is that from 2003, the Middle East generally collapsed. The post-Cold War order of the Middle East after the Iraq invasion by the United States, UK, Australia, collapsed a lot of the general order in the Middle East, and that disintegration is still felt in many ways. That's the first major center of conflict. The second one is the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Russia-Western conflict, which really erupted not in 2022, 2021, but in 2014 is when it started. So 2003, 2014, and then you had the eruption of the America-China tension, which had been brewing but was not acute until early Trump, 2016, 2017. Post-pandemic, all of those three conflicts are now united at the hip, whereas they were quite discrete. And so it's very difficult to untangle them. And so if any one of them interrupts, they all integrate, and that's where the threat for a global conflagration comes from. It's very difficult now to figure out how to solve these tensions in a comprehensive way. And I'm here probably to paint this architecture. I said the easiest to solve. Which one would you think is the easiest to solve of those three? Which one would you say is?
I mean, the whole China-US conflict, in my opinion, should be the easiest to solve.
That's probably the easiest to solve. You're right. And although I think it's probably, if there were a different presidency in the United States going the other way, but it should be the easiest to solve. And I think on the Chinese side, they'd probably be more interested in solving it than on the Western side. That said, the second easiest to solve is the Russia-Ukraine one, although it's very late in the day. The most dangerous scenario in the Russia-Ukraine conflict is that of total Russian collapse after the Putin government and some sort of entropic sets of revolutions and civil wars in that major country that enveloped the world. And that's very possible and very historical. But one way to solve it is to find a peacekeeping force that will divide the parties. And I've been talking about this since 2014, when there was fertile opportunity for it. That has largely passed, but it's still, in my view, the only way to do it. And if you were to solve that, then you create oxygen for the other conflicts. Now, so, let me just finish on that, because I will get to Sri Lanka, but because it gets interesting now. So you need a peacekeeping force between the Russian forces and the Ukrainian forces. And where would that peacekeeping force come from? Well, it cannot come from the NATO countries, so it cannot come from Canada, even though we imagine we're peacekeepers for everyone. But it cannot also come from Belarus or Armenia, no less. So the former Warsaw Pact countries that are in the Russian sphere, the Russian security sphere. So they come from a third continent that is neutral, but it has to be a continent that is highly respected by both Kiev and Moscow, and that will not be Africa. It could be the Americas, but it's more likely Asia. And so I'm coming closer to Sri Lanka because then I say, well, which countries have a peacekeeping tradition? And here we're talking about India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. And which countries are respected by both countries and neutral? And I'm come closer to India. Now, when I spoke with my Indian colleagues, when I said that they could save the world by providing a peacekeeping force that would then set the basis for a political settlement, they did not imagine that they themselves, India, were big enough to save the world. India is too small to save the world. So Sri Lanka must save the day. Sri Lanka can step up. But I say this only half jocularly because there's an opportunity there for a country like Sri Lanka to craftily insert itself and surprise people, because you'll be surprised that all of these parties, by the way, in all three conflicts are looking for exits, but they cannot. The quality of the leadership is too low, everyone is tired, and no one imagines that there's a surprise exit around the bend.
Irvin, you speak Russian?
Yeah.
Russia basically, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, they haven't embraced the full capacity or capability of their people, highly talented people, but their whole system has not evolved. Do you see that happening?
In Russia?
They really don't have a full market economy. It's a highly centralized power structure.
Yeah.
The democracy is suppressed.
Yeah.
Do the Russian people want a significant change? Because Russian history basically is very different, right?
Yeah.
Most of the population has always been suppressed.
Yeah. Well, it's difficult to say what the Russian people want. I can't comment from our seat in Colombo. And dare I say, to this day, it's very difficult for leaders in Moscow to know what the Russian people want. And more difficult than it is for leaders in Beijing to know what the Chinese people want. In a non-democracy, and Russia's never been a democracy, so we have to put that word to the side and not pretend. It's very difficult to get cues from the population. So in China, they try to do it through local government and through internet algorithms, but they don't have the electoral stimulus to motivate the leaders. And in Russia, they similarly are always searching for mechanisms to find out, well, what works with the population. The easiest thing to mobilize the masses is a military action. But the main problem in Russia, by the way, the same problem in most of the post-Soviet republics, including Ukraine, is that of succession. So if you don't have stable elections, how do you choose the next leader? Well, the next leader, as they once told me in Ukraine, is either going to jail, has been in jail, or is in jail, right? So those are the three methods of rotation. And Putin would know this just as, unfortunately, Zelensky would know this, and Lukashenko and others. In the absence of an electoral mechanism and stable succession, you always have this survivalist instinct amongst the leaders. They know that at some point their time will come, and so they're fighting for endurance. And Putin's war in Ukraine, in my earliest assessment, was this final play to make his mark and to assure the terms of his succession, because he was not able to engineer it stably in any other way, not through election, not through a dauphin. And it's not clear that if he were to have a heart attack tomorrow, what would happen with Russia, hence the disintegration scenario that worries me quite a bit. So a few parametric remarks. First of all of these countries are extremely young. Russia is not the Soviet Union, and it's not Imperial Russia. It's a startup. It's a startup country of less than 30 years. It's a brand new state. And so all the institutions are young and unstable. and they're improvising. And it's not clear that they will make it to 35. And that's a very dark prospect. On the other hand, you would say it's a wasted opportunity because they had an opportunity with high resource prices, very intelligent, energetic population, both Russia and Ukraine, and many of the others, but those are the two very important ones. Very interesting cultures, high talent in certain parts for administration and leadership, but an inability to get it together. And part of it is insufficient will, part of it is the complexity, part of it is bad luck, and part of it, dare I say, is that these are just such difficult entities to govern. I think Russia is extremely difficult to govern as a whole, and hence the whole history of collapse and renewal and revolution.
Okay, Dr. Irvin, thank you very much for the conversation. I enjoyed the time spent with you, and I hope that you have a successful trip in Sri Lanka.
Thank you very much. Estudi.
Okay.
Thank you very much.